I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Ellice Parkinson, who is going to talk to us about the importance of drinking, about low intake dehydration in older people. And she's got the learning outcomes, which I hope you can all get. They're on the programme if you want to see them. So understanding why older people are more at risk of low intake dehydration, and to understand why low intake dehydration is such an issue for older people, and to consider strategies which might improve drinking for older people. So over to you.
So thank you very much for having me today. So I'm Ellice Parkinson, a third year PhD student at the University of East Anglia, and I'm going to talk to you today about drinking and low intake dehydration in older people. So what I mean by that is when older people don't drink enough or drink sufficiently to keep well. Okay. So 1 in 3 older people are dehydrated. We have just conducted a systematic review and meta-analysis, which included 57 studies. And our meta-analysis found that 32% of older people are dehydrated globally, and this was across 11 countries. We also found that there were higher risk groups, so people with renal impairment, diabetes, and age 75 to 84 tended to be the subgroups in our analyses, which showed that people were slightly more at risk of dehydration within those groups. And also people who are living in care homes were also slightly more at risk of dehydration than people who were living in the community settings. We used serum plasma osmolality as the measure to assess dehydration in our systematic review, which is the gold standard measure for assessing dehydration for older people, which I'll come on to a little bit more because it's quite important. So why are older people more at risk of low intake dehydration? So there's lots of reasons. So older people are generally more at risk of low intake dehydration compared to a younger population, for 2 kind of main reasons, as you can see on the screen. So to the left, we've got increased fluid loss. So as we age, our kidneys become less effective at concentrating urine, which leads to more fluid loss. Older people are more prone to take diuretic medication, which encourages fluid loss to control for certain health conditions. And once again, so that leads to increased fluid loss. Then on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see some of the reasons for reduced fluid intake. So physical reasons such as maybe mobility, maybe makes it more difficult to shop for drinks, to be able to go and make yourself a drink, in terms of gripping a drink or a cup. Frailty might make it more difficult to make a drink, to be able to have a drink. Strength and reach also. So there's lots of reasons there. Thirst sensation. So as we get older, our thirst sensation becomes less effective. So where we might be guided normally by our thirst to have a drink, we then, as we get older, need to be prompted more to drink or drink more habitually or socially. Cognitive reasons. So we might, as we get older, we might develop cognitive impairment. We might forget to drink. We might not be able to recognise a drink. Communication. So if we're in a care setting, there might be language barriers to be able to ask for a drink, or communication difficulties, speech impairments, or maybe just being comfortable enough to ask someone to make someone a drink. We've got urinary incontinence. So a lot of older people say that they might intentionally restrict their fluid intake, maybe late afternoon, evening, so that they don't have to go up in the toilet during the night. This is quite a high risk factor for falls in the night and dehydration then in the morning the next day. And then there's a lot of confusion around drinking guidelines. So how much a drink actually contains. Are you recording what the drink, how much fluid was in the drink to start off with, or how much fluid was actually consumed by someone? Do we know how much men and women should be drinking? Because guidelines vary by different countries and areas. So European guidance says that women should drink 1.6 litres of drinks a day, and then men should drink 2 litres a day. But some drinking guidelines includes body weight. There's lots of various different ways, and it's quite confusing. There's also the NHS guidance, which says 6 to 8 drinks, and some people get confused thinking that should just be of water. So there's lots of confusion around this and lots of awareness and education that needs to happen around this. So low intake dehydration is difficult to identify in older people. So I touched upon this when I mentioned serum plasma osmolality. So Lee Hooper and Dan Bunn did a study in care home residents, and they used serum plasma osmolality as kind of the gold standard reference. So it uses blood, it's a blood test which goes to the lab to be assessed for osmolality values. They use this as their reference standard, and then alongside 49 other common signs and symptoms of dehydration, which you'll probably see used in older people all the time. So kind of pinching the skin or sunken eyes, the thirst sensation, urine colours, another really common one. So they assessed all of these signs and symptoms in older care home residents alongside the gold standard reference, and none of the 49 signs and symptoms were effective in diagnostically accurately diagnosing low intake dehydration for older people. The only reference standard, the only measure which works accurately in older people is serum plasma osmolality, which you might be thinking is not the easiest thing to just take blood from older people all the time. So why is low intake dehydration a concern for older people? So why does this matter? Why are we looking into it, and why are we trying to raise awareness of it? So you've probably seen headlines like this one. So hundreds of care home patients have died dehydrated or malnourished. So it's a big topic area and has been for a long while. And there's a bit of a blame game around it, which isn't helpful. So low intake dehydration is associated with lots of health conditions for older people. So UTIs, headaches, falls, pneumonia, cancer, renal impairment, diabetes, cognitive impairment, cancers, and also death. So the risk of hospitalisation also increases for these individuals. The risk of dying is doubled for dehydrated older people. If they're admitted to hospital dehydrated, their risk of dying is double in hospital. It's also really costly to society. So dehydration is preventable. It's preventable by drinking, and yet it's staggering, although the economic analyses are difficult because they're not based on kind of the gold standard measure of dehydration, which I've just spoken about. In the US alone, in 1999, it was estimated to cost, preventable dehydration was estimated to cost £1.4 billion in the US alone for dehydration of older people. So it's really costly. It's costly to people's lives, it's costly to society, and it's preventable. So what's the solution? So I'm saying it's difficult to assess. It's not the most accessible measure to make sure that we're getting accurate measures of dehydration. What's the solution? Drinking. You would think that would be so straightforward. So we know it's not. Drinking is really complicated in older people for all the reasons I spoke about at the beginning. It's really complicated. However, it is avoidable. So on the next slide, I'm just going to talk through some strategies. What we do know, so there's been no long-term interventions in the research literature to show anything that has been sustainable for a long period of time to prevent dehydration. What we do know is the multi-pronged approach is the most useful, and consistency is also key. So I've just written some bits here. So drinks preferences, speaking to someone about what drink they would prefer, which might change day to day, it might change week to week. The temperature of their drink, what kind of drink they might prefer at different times of day. Having accurate records of fluid intake. So recording exactly what someone has consumed rather than how much was made in the drink, making sure that the same person is recording their fluid intake. If someone is able to, so particularly a care home resident, if they're able to, it's actually been found that their record of fluid intake records was more accurate than sometimes the staff's records. Putting fluid in foods, so soups and ice creams, Thinking if someone can reach a drink. So is a drink out of someone's way? Is it in a jug, which is maybe just too far on a table away? Thinking of the weight of a drink to lift. So if someone's quite frail, they might have a smaller cup to hold. But then if it's a smaller cup, it needs to be refilled. More often, you need to have more of those smaller cups to make sure that someone's getting their fluid intake for the day. So it's trying to think of all those different things. Someone might have a favourite cup or mug. So if they don't recognise maybe a care home's mug, maybe kind of their old special mug from home. Someone needs to be able to recognise that a drink belongs to them and not to someone else, for them to be able to drink that drink and know that that's theirs. People might need reminding to drink. I come back to the fact that we need to know how much a mug or a cup contains to know that someone's meeting their fluid intake guidance for the day. Allowing someone enough time to drink. So someone spoke to me before about that they actually preferred their cup of tea to go cold first, but it used to get taken away because generally most people's preference would be to have a hot cup of tea. So allowing someone enough time to have their drink. Communication is key, however that might be. Making drinking fun. So during the heat wave, I heard of some fantastic things about ice lollies and kind of mocktail bars, making drinking fun and part of activities all the time, rather than it just being a tea round, making sure that drinking's sociable and fun. And once again, knowing how much someone should be drinking. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of drinking and low intake dehydration. I really hope that you've been able to take something away from this today. And thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you. That was brilliant. I think it's really interesting that we're reminded of the barriers to difficulties in drinking, and also unpicking some of that confusion around dehydration. And of course, we know that dehydration and risk of malnutrition all goes together. You know, it's part and parcel of a big problem. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.